From Baltic warnings to Beijing's response, Europe is finding itself caught between China, Russia, and Ukraine. Exactly 1 week ago, Estonia, one of the Baltic states renowned for its firm stance on Russia, issued a stark warning. This message wasn't just aimed at Moscow, it was also directed squarely at Beijing. Speaking ahead of a critical week for European leaders, Estonian officials emphasized that the decisions made regarding compensation loans for Ukraine, potentially backed by frozen Russian assets, would fundamentally shape the future of European security and its relationship with global powers. The continent was on the cusp of a decision that would send ripples far beyond its borders. The financial lifeline for Ukraine remains at the heart of the European Union's discussions. With more than $210 billion in frozen Russian assets held within the bloc, the debate centers on how to leverage these funds to support Kyiv's staggering needs. Ukraine is projected to require approximately $90 billion over the next 2 years alone, a figure that puts immense pressure on EU finances. Estonia and its Nordic partners have been vocal proponents of escalating the pressure on Russia, arguing for a new, more robust sanctions package. In a joint proposal, Finland, Estonia, and Sweden even suggested imposing punitive tariffs on all remaining imports from Russia and Belarus, aiming to cripple Moscow's ability to fund its war effort. In these high-stakes discussions, China was explicitly brought into the conversation. Estonian officials stressed that Russia's war against Ukraine represents a fundamental, existential threat to the European security order. They argued that China's role in this conflict, particularly its economic and technological support for Russia's war machine, could not be overlooked. While the door for dialogue between the EU and China remains technically open, Estonian leaders made it clear that Europe must first address the immediate security risks posed by the Russia-Ukraine war before normal diplomatic and economic relations could be prioritized. This stance set the stage for a tense diplomatic exchange. These powerful statements from a small Baltic nation did not go unnoticed in Beijing. The response from China came swiftly and with an element of surprise that caught many European observers off guard. Instead of retaliating with diplomatic sanctions against governments, Beijing chose a different, more strategic path. It targeted one of Europe's most politically sensitive and vulnerable sectors, agriculture. The move was a masterclass in applying precise, targeted economic pressure designed to maximize internal political fallout. Within the EU, China announced the imposition of steep, prohibitive tariffs reaching as high as 42.7% in certain dairy products imported. From the European Union, the announcement sent immediate shockwaves across the continent, particularly among European farmers who were already grappling with the difficult economic reality of rising operational costs and declining incomes. For seasoned political and trade analysts, the message from Beijing was unambiguous and crystal clear. China was demonstrating its willingness and its capability to apply pressure precisely where it would hurt the most. Not in the halls of Brussels, but in the domestic political arenas of individual member states. However, the escalating trade tensions between China and the European Union are not a new phenomenon. For years, Europe has been running a substantial and growing trade deficit with China, importing significantly more goods than it exports. What has fundamentally changed in recent years is the nature and sophistication of Chinese exports. Europe is no longer just importing low-cost textiles, footwear, and consumer electronics. Instead, the continent's markets are now seeing a rapid influx of Chinese electric vehicles, advanced batteries, green technologies, and sophisticated electronics, all of which are gaining market share at an astonishing pace. This economic shift mirrors the trade tensions that have long defined the relationship between China and the United States. While the U.S. has a strong export base in agricultural goods like soybeans and corn, it faces a deluge of high-value manufactured products from China. This dynamic has resulted in persistent, politically charged trade imbalances that have fueled significant political backlash on both sides of the Atlantic. Europe is now finding itself in a similar predicament. Confronting a new era of competition from a technologically advanced and economically powerful China, Europe is also grappling with a series of deep-seated structural challenges that compound its economic vulnerabilities. Labor costs across the bloc are high. Energy prices remain stubbornly elevated. The continent's overall industrial competitiveness has shown signs of weakening. This decline has been particularly acute since the loss of cheap Russian energy, a cornerstone of the industrial model for decades, especially for Germany. As the traditional industrial engine of the European Union, Germany has been disproportionately affected by these new economic realities, leading to concerns about deindustrialization and long-term economic stagnation. In response to these mounting pressures, the European Union has increasingly turned to protective trade measures to shield its industries. Under the banners of fair competition and strategic autonomy, the EU has introduced a series of defensive policies. These include imposing tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, placing restrictions on Chinese firms from participating in public procurement contracts, and implementing tighter controls on technology transfers. Predictably, China has not taken these measures lightly. It has responded in kind with its own investigations and countermeasures, including the recent restrictions on agricultural imports, creating a tit-for-tat cycle of escalating trade disputes. Diplomatic efforts to de-escalate these tensions have, so far, yielded very limited results. In early December, a delegation of senior EU officials, including the President of the European Commission, traveled to China with the hope of reviving trade cooperation and finding common ground. However, according to reports, the discussions quickly stalled. European leaders reportedly made their cooperation contingent on China changing its stance on Ukraine, a demand that complicated negotiations on major commercial deals, including a significant order for Airbus aircraft. The trip ended without any major breakthroughs, highlighting the deep-seated disagreements between the two sides. Meanwhile, European officials have continued to publicly warn about what they describe as China's industrial overcapacity, arguing that state-subsidized production in sectors like steel, solar panels, and electric vehicles is distorting global markets and creating an unlevel playing field. Beijing vehemently rejects these claims. Chinese officials frame their country's industrial success as the result of legitimate competition and innovation, while accusing Europe of protectionism and applying hypocritical double standards. They argue that Europe is simply trying to protect its uncompetitive industries from a more dynamic and efficient global player. Against this already complex and tense backdrop, Ukraine has added another layer of complexity to the geopolitical equation. In a recent address, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky announced that his government was preparing a new round of sanctions. These measures would target individuals and entities that are supporting Russia's defense industry, not only within Russia, but also abroad, with a clear implication that Chinese companies could be in the crosshairs. While these sanctions may be largely symbolic in their immediate impact, the statement served as a powerful signal of Ukraine's alignment with the broader Western pressure campaign against both Russia and its enablers. At the same time, Europe is facing a wave of growing unrest and instability at home. Farmers across France, Belgium, Germany, and other EU member states have staged large-scale, disruptive protests. They are driven by a potent combination of grievances, including the rising cost of fertilizers, lower than expected crop yields, and deep-seated fears that EU funds will be diverted away from traditional agricultural subsidies to finance military and financial support for Ukraine. The proposed EU-South America trade agreement, known as the Mercosur deal, has further intensified these anxieties. With farmers worried about being undercut by cheaper agricultural imports, these domestic pressures highlight a profound and difficult dilemma for Europe's leaders. The European Union is attempting to perform a precarious balancing act. It is trying to uphold its geopolitical commitments to Ukraine, maintain its economic competitiveness in a rapidly changing global market, and ensure social stability at home, while navigating increasingly complex and often adversarial relationships with both China and Russia. The competing demands are pulling the bloc in multiple directions at once, making coherent policymaking incredibly difficult. China's strategic decision to target European agricultural imports follows a familiar playbook. This tactic was seen during the US-China trade war, when Beijing strategically reduced its purchases of American soybeans. That move was designed to inflict maximum political pain on key voting blocs in rural agricultural states, thereby placing immense pressure on the US government. In Europe, where farmer protests already represent a significant and growing political challenge for incumbent governments, the impact of similar measures could be even more destabilizing, potentially fueling populist and anti-EU sentiment. As the frozen Russian assets remain locked in a complex web of legal uncertainty, and as EU borrowing increases to finance the massive support packages for Ukraine, the financial burden ultimately falls on the shoulders of European taxpayers. With economic growth across the continent slowing and public finances already under considerable strain, governments are facing difficult and politically unpopular trade-offs. They must choose between their foreign policy ambitions and their domestic priorities, a choice that is becoming more painful with each passing month. Taken together, these interconnected developments point to a widening fault line in global politics. What began as a series of security policy decisions related to Russia's invasion of Ukraine is now spilling over into every facet of international relations. It is reshaping trade dynamics, influencing diplomatic alignments, and fueling internal political turmoil within the European Union. In the process, it is drawing China more deeply and directly into Europe's strategic calculations, transforming a regional conflict into a global confrontation. Europe now finds itself navigating a complex, fragile, and unpredictable landscape. It is a world where a decision made in Brussels, a statement issued in Tallinn, or a military development in Kyiv can trigger an immediate and powerful reaction in Beijing. And in this new reality, the consequences are no longer confined to diplomatic conference rooms or financial trading floors. They are increasingly being felt on the streets, on the farms, and in the factories of the continent, shaping the daily lives of millions of Europeans.